In the spring of 1274 BC, on the banks of the Orontes River, in what is now Syria, the largest chariot battle in human history was unfolding. On one side stood the Egyptian army of Ramesses II, around 20,000 men divided into 4 divisions named for the gods Amun, Ra, Ta, and Set. On the other side stood the army of the Hittite, King Muwatalli II, an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 troops, and somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 chariots. By the time the dust settled, the pharaoh had nearly been captured. His Amun division had been overrun. He had fought off Hittite chariots almost personally. Egypt's eastern empire was on the verge of collapse, and Egypt did not win the battle. At best, Ramesses fought to a draw. At worst, he lost outright. 16 years later, in 1259 BC, the two empires signed what is now considered the oldest known international peace treaty on Earth. A copy hangs at the United Nations in New York. It was carved into clay tablets in the Hittite capital and onto temple walls in Egypt, and it formally ended the conflict between two superpowers as equals. The empire that fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh was the Hittite Empire. Its capital, Hattusa, sat on a mountainous plateau in what is now central Turkey. Its archives still contain over 30,000 cuneiform tablets, recording diplomacy, religion, law, and language. The walls of Hattusa enclosed an area larger than ancient Athens, defended by stone gates, flanked by massive carved lions. For 2 centuries, the Hittites controlled most of Anatolia, dominated northern Syria, and dictated terms to Babylonia. And then around 1180 BC, they collapsed in the same wave that ended the entire Bronze Age world. Their cities were burned, their archives were sealed under rubble. Their language was forgotten for more than 3,000 years. When the language was finally read again, in 1917, by the Czech linguist Bedřich Krozen, the result was a shock. The Hittite language was Indo-European. It belonged to the same family as Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, English, and Russian, and that single fact set off a century of theorizing about who the Hittites actually were and where they had come from, because in the world of historical linguistics, an Indo-European language carries a heavy implication. It implies an origin somewhere on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a band of grasslands stretching from modern Ukraine to Kazakhstan. It implies a population of horse-riding pastoralists, the Yamnaya culture, who fanned out from those steppes around 5,000 years ago. It implies migration on a continental scale, and it implies that the Hittites, the people who built one of the great Bronze Age empires, were the descendants of that migration. Steppe riders who had come south, crossed the Caucasus or threaded through the Balkans, settled in Anatolia, and eventually founded an empire strong enough to crush Egypt at Kadesh. For most of the 20th century, that was the consensus. The textbooks said it, the documentaries showed it. The Hittites were, in popular imagination, a kind of Bronze Age cavalry from the steppe, transplanted into Anatolia, ruling over an indigenous Anatolian peasantry. 2 competing models tried to refine the picture. The first, the steppe hypothesis, also called the Kurgan hypothesis, was developed in detail by the Lithuanian-American archaeologist Marija Gimbutas in the 1950s and 1960s. It placed the Indo-European homeland firmly on the Pontic-Caspian steppe and explained the spread of every Indo-European language as the consequence of one or more waves of migration out of that homeland. Hittites included. The second, the Anatolian hypothesis, was put forward by the British archaeologist Colin Renfrew in 1987. It argued the opposite. The Indo-European homeland, in his view, was Anatolia itself. The languages had spread outward from Anatolia with the expansion of farming, beginning around 9,000 years ago. Under that model, the Hittites would not have come from anywhere. They would have been native to Anatolia all along. For nearly 40 years, those 2 hypotheses fought for primacy in archaeology, linguistics, and prehistory journals. The steppe model usually won, partly because of horse evidence, partly because of pottery distributions, and partly because by the early 2010s, ancient DNA from European Bronze Age sites had begun lining up neatly behind it. Studies in 2015 by David Reich's lab at Harvard and by Eski Willerslev's lab in Copenhagen showed that across northern and central Europe, Bronze Age populations had absorbed massive amounts of steppe ancestry from the Yamnaya. The genetic signature of the Pontic-Caspian was suddenly visible everywhere from Britain to the Volga. The case for a steppe looked close, and then somebody finally tested the Hittites. The problem before that was simple. Bones do not record languages, and pottery does not record DNA. Hittite skeletons existed in Turkish museums by the dozens, but for decades, nobody could directly read what was written inside them. Cranial measurements were inconclusive. Burial customs were ambiguous. Even the famous Hittite chariot, often pointed to as proof of steppe heritage, turned out to be a much later technology than any Yamnaya migration. Chariots only became militarily significant in the second millennium BC. Around 5 centuries after the steppe expansion, the steppe hypothesis required. The horse argument was no better. Horses had been ridden in the Pontic-Caspian region since the 4th millennium BC, but Anatolian horse evidence dating to before 2000 BC was scarce and contested. The supposedly steppe-coded culture of the Hittites, on closer inspection, lacked the very markers that should have been there. No mounted warrior burials, no Kurgan-style mounds in the Hittite heartland, no identifiable Yamnaya-style pottery. The archaeology was, at best, ambiguous. The linguistics could not arbitrate by itself, and the bones held the only answer that mattered, but they were not yet speaking. Then in 2022, a team led by Iosif Lazaridis at Harvard Medical School, in collaboration with Song Al-Alpaslan Rudenberg, Ron Pinhasi at the University of Vienna, and David Reich, published 3 companion papers in the journal Science under the umbrella title The Genetic History of the Southern Arc. Together, those papers reported on hundreds of ancient genomes, drawn from Anatolia, the Caucasus, the Levant, and the Aegean, spanning roughly 10,000 years of human history. The samples included Neolithic farmers, Chalcolithic villagers, early Bronze Age populations from across western and central Anatolia, and the populations who lived inside the Hittite imperial core in the 2nd millennium BC. Every genome was extracted using the same lab pipeline, processed against the same reference panels, and analyzed using the same statistical tools that had nailed down steppe ancestry across Europe. The methods that had built the case for steppe Indo-Europeans elsewhere were now turned on the Hittites themselves. The result was unexpected and unambiguous. Bronze Age Anatolians, including those living inside the Hittite Empire, carried no detectable steppe ancestry. None. Not as a major component, not as a minor component, not at the trace levels that might suggest a small founding population, followed by demographic dilution. The signal that defined Bronze Age Europe was, in Anatolia, simply not there. The Hittites' deepest ancestral layer was indigenous Anatolian Neolithic farmer DNA, the same component that had been in Anatolia since the dawn of agriculture nearly 9,000 years before. On top of that sat additional ancestry from the Caucasus, what geneticists call Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry, and a related Iranian Neolithic component. Neither of those is steppe, neither requires a migration from the Pontic-Caspian. Both could be explained by movement of people across the Caucasus Mountains and around the eastern shore of the Black Sea. But the source was Caucasian and Iranian, not Yamnaya. The empire that crushed Egypt at Kadesh was genetically local, not Western Eurasian transplants, not riders from a faraway grassland. The Hittites were the descendants of populations that had been farming, herding, and building cities in Anatolia since the early Neolithic, supplemented by genetic flows from neighbors immediately to the east. Their ancestors had not crossed the steppe. Their ancestors had not crossed the Caucasus from the north in any major demographic wave. The simplest version of the steppe hypothesis, the version where every Indo-European language was carried into place by the same migration, was for the Hittites, flatly contradicted by their own DNA. But here is where it gets complicated, because if it stopped there, the story would be simple, and ancient DNA stories are almost never simple. The Hittites still spoke an Indo-European language. That fact had not changed. The Hittite vocabulary, the Hittite grammar, the inflectional system, the relationship to Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, none of that was an illusion. Hittite was Indo-European, and so were its sister languages, Luwian and Palailic, all spoken across Anatolia. In the 2nd millennium BC, the Anatolian branch of Indo-European existed. It just did not arrive in the genomes of its speakers. That paradox forced a revision of the entire field. The most widely discussed solution today is what linguists call the Indo-Anatolian hypothesis, an idea first floated decades ago by the Dutch linguist Frederik Kortlandt and developed by others over time, but which until 2022 had relatively little support outside of specialist linguistic circles. The hypothesis argues that the Anatolian languages were not part of Proto-Indo-European at all in the standard sense. They were sisters of it, a common ancestor language, sometimes called Proto-Indo-Anatolian, split very early into two branches. One branch became Anatolian and was carried into Anatolia by an early movement of people, possibly from somewhere across the Caucasus or northwest of Iran. Well before the Yamnaya expansion, the other branch stayed in or near the steppe and became the Proto-Indo-European of the textbooks, and that one fanned out across Eurasia with the Yamnaya. Under this model, the Hittites speak the descendant of the older sister. The reason no steppe DNA shows up in their bones is that no steppe people were involved. The Anatolian language family branched off before there was a steppe homeland in the classical sense. This is not a small revision. It removes the Hittites from the standard narrative of Indo-European expansion entirely. It implies that the language family is older than Yamnaya. It pushes the deepest split in Indo-European back, by some estimates, to around 4,500 BC or earlier, well before the canonical steppe expansions of the late 4th and 3rd millennia BC, and it leaves an entirely separate question on the table. If the Anatolian languages did not come from the steppe, where did they come from? Linguists have proposed Caucasian roots, Transcaucasian roots, even an exit point through the eastern Caucasus into eastern Anatolia, followed by gradual westward spread. The Lazaridis team's data hints at exactly this kind of movement, with Caucasus-related ancestry showing up in eastern Anatolian samples earlier and more strongly than further west, and the signal slowly diluting as you move toward the Aegean. The geography is suggestive. The exact route is not yet pinned down. Three other complications matter. The first is that across Anatolia as a whole, including in Hittite period samples, a tiny amount of steppe-related ancestry does appear in some individuals from the late Bronze Age, but only at low frequency and only in certain regions. It is not the kind of pervasive signal that defines Bronze Age Europe. It looks more like the genetic trace of a small number of incoming individuals, probably traders, mercenaries, or marriage partners, rather than the demographic core of any population. The second is that the Anatolian samples available for the 2nd millennium BC are still relatively few. There are Hittite period genomes published, including individuals from sites in central Turkey associated with the empire's heartland, but the sample sizes do not yet match the hundreds of European Bronze Age genomes that built the original steppe case. More samples could shift the picture in detail, although the absence of steppe ancestry has been confirmed across enough independent samples that a complete reversal is now extremely unlikely. The third is that genetics cannot tell you what people thought of themselves. The Hittites called their own language Nazili, after the city of Nasa, and they were perfectly aware that several languages were spoken inside their empire, including Hattic, a non-Indo-European language belonging to a separate, older Anatolian population that the incoming Indo-European speakers had encountered and partly absorbed. The Hittites, in their own texts, distinguished themselves from the older Hattic-speaking population. They knew there had been someone there before them. The DNA suggests that the someone was, in genetic terms, the same population. Zoom out, and the consequences ripple far beyond one empire. If Anatolian Indo-European arrived without a major demographic migration, then language replacement on a continental scale is possible without population replacement. That contradicts the simplest version of the steppe model, in which language always rides on demographic movement. It also reopens the door, partially, to ideas that the steppe model had largely closed. Cultural elite dominance, in which a small number of speakers of a prestige language can reshape the linguistic identity of a much larger population without leaving a strong genetic trace, is back on the menu, at least for some cases. So is gradual contact-driven language spread along trade and migration corridors. The picture across the wider Indo-European world becomes layered. Some branches, the Indo-Iranian, the Balto-Slavic, the Germanic, the Italic, the Celtic, the Greek, do correlate with massive Bronze Age genetic turnovers tied to the steppe. The Anatolian branch does not. Two different stories are now visible inside the same language family. It changes how we read the Hittites themselves. They were not invaders pretending to be locals. They were locals speaking a language whose deeper history points elsewhere. The empire they built was carved out of populations whose ancestors had been in those mountains for thousands of years, who had built Sidalhaig in the Neolithic, who had farmed, smelted, and traded across Western Asia long before any horse rider arrived. The Hittites of Kadesh, the kings buried under the floors of Hattusa, the scribes who carved the Egyptian peace treaty into clay, all of them were the genetic continuation of the people who had always been there. It changes how we read the Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry that flowed westward into Europe at the start of farming 8,000 to 7,000 years ago. That farmer ancestry is one of the three foundational components of modern European populations, alongside steppe ancestry and earlier hunter-gatherer ancestry. Every European today carries some Anatolian Neolithic farmer DNA. In a sense, the Hittites' deeper ancestors are also the deeper ancestors of every European, every North African coastal population, and every Levantine community. The geographic isolation of Anatolia, between the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Caucasus, preserved a population continuity unusual for the ancient world. The Hittite Empire sat on top of one of the deepest continuous populations in West Asia, and it changes how we read the moment of collapse. When the Bronze Age world ended around 1180 BC and Hattusa burned, the empire fell, but the people did not vanish. The same DNA shows up in Iron Age Anatolia. It shows up in Roman period samples from the same regions. It shows up in modern Turkish populations, layered with later inputs from Central Asia and the Balkans, but never replaced. The Hittites did not migrate away. They stayed where they had always been. The political collapse buried their language, their archives, and their gods. It did not bury their bloodline. It is still there in the people who farm those highlands today. What it does not tell us, what no genome can yet tell us, is exactly how an Indo-European language reached Central Anatolia in the first place, without leaving a clear demographic signature. That is the open question. It is the next thing the field has to solve. The candidate routes are narrow. They go around or across the Caucasus. They funnel through the eastern fringes of Anatolia. They thread through populations that are themselves only beginning to be sampled in detail. Ancient DNA from 2nd millennium BC, eastern Turkey, from the southern Caucasus, from northwest Iran, is being collected and sequenced now. Each new sample is a chance to catch the moment. A small group of speakers of an early Anatolian language pass through, leaving traces in the lexicon of the people they met, but only minor traces in their genomes. Several research groups, including teams in Vienna, Leipzig, and Boston, are working on exactly that problem. The answer, if it comes, will probably arrive the same way the Hittite answer arrived, in a single set of papers that quietly displaces a century of consensus. For now, what the DNA has settled is more limited, but also more profound. The empire that crushed Egypt at Kadesh was not a transplant. The chariots that rolled across the Orontes were not driven by descendants of the Pontic Caspian. The Hittites were not steppe riders who had become Anatolian. They were Anatolian all along. Their ancestors had been in those mountains since the first farms, and their descendants are still there. The story of an Indo-European empire that built itself out of indigenous Anatolian DNA, while speaking a language whose family had originated somewhere distant enough that no one in Hattusa could have remembered, is now part of the record. The textbooks that traced their bloodline to the steppe were wrong. The Hittites had nowhere to come from. They were already home. But the language they carried, and the route it took to reach them, is a question the bones still cannot answer. And until they can, every cuneiform tablet in the archives of Hattusa, every Indo-European route preserved in the Hittite lexicon, every line of the world's first peace treaty, sits between two facts that do not yet fit together. The people were local. The words were not. Somewhere along the corridor between the Caucasus and the Halys River, an answer is buried in the genome of a population that has not yet been sampled. And the next time ancient DNA is extracted from a tooth in eastern Anatolia, the question of how a language outran its own speakers may finally have the beginning of an answer. Sources for everything in this investigation are linked in the description below. If this kind of evidence-based investigation is what keeps you coming back, subscribe, because the next belief that DNA dismantles is already in the lab. The Hittites crushed Egypt. They wrote the world's first peace treaty. They spoke a language that traveled across half a continent, and they did all of it without ever leaving the mountains they were born in. The bones don't care what the textbooks say.